Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Rhinebeck Historical Society's monthly talk. Tonight I'm going to talk about researching the history of a house, using my house as an example. I've lived in my house for about 8 years in the village of Rhinebeck, and I've often wondered when it was built and who lived in it. So tonight's talk is going to be in two parts. First, about the history of the house, and second, about the people who lived in it. 6 months ago, I met with town historian Nancy Kelly and asked her if she'd be willing to help me do this research. And she said absolutely, but she'd wanted me to document it so I could share it with others. So the first thing that she did was give me this brochure, Researching the History of Your Rhinebeck Home, which is available in the local history room at the Star Library or on the town website. And you can find out the 4 websites I'm going to talk about tonight at an article I wrote 3 months ago for the winter 2011 newsletter of the Rhinebeck Historical Society, and it's available at rhinebeckhistoricalsociety.org. When I wrote the article, I had a lot more photographs, maps, deeds than I could possibly fit in a 3-page article, and that's why I decided to give this talk. So let's start with the picture of my house. It's on the corner of Market and Mulberry Street in the village of Rhinebeck. Here's a picture of the Market Street view. And then we have a picture of the Mulberry Street view. And here's a picture of the garage. Now, the first place you can look is Dutchess Parcel Access. Dutchess County has a wonderful website. And when you bring it up, you see a map of the county, of the Dutchess County, and you see in the upper right-hand corner, you can have a drop-down menu for any town or village in the county, and I dropped down Rhinebeck Village and typed in my name. You can type in name, parcel number, or street address, and up comes the street. And you can see the house, you can see the garage, and when you click on that, by the way, you can pan through any house in the village and get the information about when it was built, who owns it, and statistics about the house. This slide shows that it says it was built in 1930. So that's a start. The second place I looked was a website in Albany. In 1979, 388 houses in the village of Rhinebeck were declared members of the National Historic Registry. And here's a page of the registry describing my house, and it says it was built in 1850, excuse me. So we have 2 dates now. The third place that I looked was I typed in my address into Google, and up came a place called livingplaces.com. And it has apparently all over the country entries for each town and village. I found this for Rhinebeck, and it describes a bunch of houses, including mine, with this description about federal-style houses. The early 19th century federal-style dwellings, it lists all these houses, including mine, and it says circa 1810 to 1820s. So now I have 2 things. Now I said, okay, I got 50, I got 30, and I got 20s. So, okay, where do I go from here? So Nancy said, you have to go down to the county clerk's office on Market Street in Poughkeepsie, and they have all the deeds. So I went down there with the piece of information, next slide, that I was given to at the closing on my house, an old deed. And this deed, which is from 1963, is Simon Kliegler and his wife being changed to Simon Kliegler. This apparently was because of a divorce. But the important piece of information on here is that this was recorded on Lieber 1103, page 815. What does that mean? So I went down to the county clerk's office. I met with Brad Kendall, the county clerk, who's absolutely terrific. And he spent 2 hours with me, taking me back in time, researching this house, and he loves doing this kind of work. So what he said is that they have books going back to 1715, and book 1 all the way up to 2012, which is probably book almost 2000 by now, I'm sure. So this is book 1103, page 815. And when you go to that, which is, I believe, the next slide, it's the 1952 deed, which says Marion Stickle, residing at 97 Montgomery Street, from the estate of A. Lee Stickle, her husband, sells the house to Simon Kliegler and his wife. And once we go down here, we have Lieber 366, page 341. So we go get that, go back get that book, and that says 1909. In 1909, Franklin and Ellen Riker of Rhinebeck sell their house to Frank B. Stickle. And so the interesting part now here is Frank Stickle bought it in 1909, and Bill Gay, who volunteers in here in the library on Tuesdays, is doing like a manual index of the Gazette Advertiser. We have 150 years of it, but we don't have an index for it. I'm going to talk about that later. And Bill Gay said, I just passed something about that. He said, there's an article in the 1909 Gazette Advertiser, which is the next slide, and it says, this one sentence, it's a miracle. Frank B. Stickle is preparing to erect a brick stable to newly acquired house. Go, amazing, I've got it, so I'm half done. 1909, Frank Stickle bought the house. 1909, Frank Stickle built the garage. Amazing. So I'm half there.
It was stable.
And now, huh?
It was a stable.
Yes, there are 3 horse stalls in there and a hayloft. It's a wonderful building inside. And thanks to Jan Stickle, I got a photograph, which is the next slide, of Frank and Rosie Stickle and their son Alfred L. And from 6 years later, covered in ivy. It still grows a lot of ivy, and every couple of years you have to pull it off. And by the way, the brick is fine after 103 years, so ivy does not disturb the brick of a building. I don't know who started that rumor.
Depends on the ivy.
Ah!
If it's English ivy, take it off. If it's not, you're fine.
Thank you. Well, it's obviously not English. It must be Rhinebeck ivy.
Yes. Boston ivy.
Depends on how good a brick job they did, too.
Right. The only change that's taken place in the 103 years is this window was taken out, and I think Dr. Klieger, or perhaps a Stickle, made this into a 2-door, which you can see, and I'll go back on the next slide, what it looks like today. Exactly the same. There's the hayloft door slide open, this slides open, and this is now a 2-car garage. But everything else is exactly the same. And even these granite columns that they tied their horses up on is still there. You know, hasn't changed. So it's a wonderful building. So I'm half done. So the deed said, pointed, the 1909 Frank Stickle deed pointed to the next book down, Lieber 297, page 299, which is a 1989 deed, which 1898 deed, which says Jacob Hanneberg sells the house to Franklin Reichert, who sold it in 1909 to Frank Stickle. So that's good. But now I got a problem. There's no numbers here. There's no Lieber numbers. I said, how do I keep going back? So Brad Canville said, we have index books going back to 1715 as well. So because the numbers were not recorded on deeds before then. So I went to the index books. We pulled, I said, when did Hanneberg buy this house? He sold it in 1898. When did he buy the house? So the next slide will show, this is the book. There are 2 sets of books. There's about 20 each by grantor and by grantee. So you can look at either way. And I started scanning from 1898, coming up, 92, 91, Jacob Hanneberg bought the house from J.C. McCarty. Book 260, page 66. So it works. So now we pulled out, Mr. Kendall pulled out that book for me, 258, and the next deed shows this indenture made between the estates of Louisa Pultz and Eliza Pultz, lunatics. I said, what? But after I collected all of these deeds, Nancy told me, go speak to town attorney Herman Tejan. He's great, and he can interpret these deeds, he can explain to you what it means, because I was beginning to get lost in all of this stuff. Because it goes on, you know, said lunatics being unable to pay their debts. Herman underlined that. He said it was a sort of a way that people refer to senile, you know, old folks in and J.C. McCarty was a lawyer, and he obviously did the transaction for them. They still do. the important thing is Pulse. I said, I've heard that name before. And Nancy Kelly told me that on the map over here, which we have a copy of, on the next slide, there's a map from 1867 on that door over there. And this is the corner again, Market and Mulberry. It says Pete Pulse, which is Peter Pulse. There's a little house next door. Peter Pulse owned this property, which is the Bowery House Tavern. This is S. McCarty, Stephen McCarty, who was J.C. McCarty's father, the lawyer. And the Episcopal Church, which is now the Catholic Church. So Peter Pulse was very involved in this corner. He actually lived here before he moved into my house. This was so famous that it was called Pulse's Corner at one point, because Peter was so involved in it. So I said, I'm on the right track, because I've got Eliza and Louisa Pulse.
Is that Episcopal Church there?
That's now the Episcopal Church of the Messiah on Montgomery Street, on Route 9.
Yeah, but that was originally.
That was originally here.
The Catholics took it. It was the Episcopal Church.
Yes, now it's the Catholic Church.
But it wasn't quite fancy enough for the river people.
John Jacob Astor. Yes.
That's true. They wanted a fancier one for when they brought their friends, you know, up for the weekend or the week or so forth to go to church.
It's very nice. We had a program there a few months ago,
That's how you
which we
got that
taped.
Messiah Church.
We'll come to the next thing and read all about.
Before we go on now, this land here, and you can see on this old map, Livingston Street stops at Mulberry. It does not go through. It's now part of horticultural grounds. But this land is all owned by the Dutch Reformed Church, which is now the Rhinebeck Reformed Church, because in 1731, Henry Beekman gave the land that 134 of the village houses are built on. And when I was at the closing on my house, I said to my attorney, I don't understand this. I'm confused. How could I not own my land? He said, it's unusual, but it does happen. He said his mother owns a condo in Hawaii, and you're not allowed to own land in Hawaii unless you're a native Hawaiian. So she has a lease on her land and her condo in Hawaii. So the only problem is Henry Beekman didn't understand inflation. So my rent is $9 a year. And I've been told that that's expensive. Some people pay 75 cents.
58.
58 cents, okay.
$2.25.
$2.25. So I said to my lawyer, I don't understand what this means. And he says, are you worried you're going to have to join the Rhinebeck Reformed Church? I said, no, I want to know if I have to pay taxes. He said, yes, you're not a church. You have to pay taxes. So at the closing, we're doing all these signing papers, and we're signing a check to the lawyer, and a check to the title company, a check to the bank. Now, one more check, $270 to the church. I said, what's that for? He said, 30 years of rent. The bank wants to make sure that you're not going to default on your rent. So he said, but I'm sure if you sell your house before 30 years, you could try to persuade the church into giving you your $9 back. That's what you're worried about.
You got a letter.
You got a letter.
Just recently.
That they want their money back.
They want a refund. Yeah.
So if we look at the next slide, you can see this is the map of the church land, 134 properties, and I've highlighted mine. That's lot number 33, which you're going to see in a few minutes on some papers. 34 is a little house next door. 31 is the tavern across the street, and 28, I believe, over here is the McCarty house. So this map is later because now you can see Livingston Street is punched through all the way to Beach Street, although there aren't many houses. This just could have been lots that the church drew, and there might not have been houses on here yet either. I don't know the date of this map.
And you can see how Beach doesn't go through like it does today,
Right,
down below.
right. So, you know, this might have just been laid out. But Bud Rogers, who I went to see a little bit after that, because I said, let me take the last thing and I'll talk about him. So the last deed I found, I went to the P index now, Pulse, 1890. When did Peter Pulse buy the house? So I went to the P index, the next slide, and I came up from 1890, 1836, Peter Pulse, LeGrand Curtis, book 60. We're really getting down there now. Page 615. So we went to that deed, which someone must have retyped, because it says 1836 between LeGrand Curtis and Stephen McCarty and Peter Pulse of Rhinebeck. But attorney Herman Teachin said this is not the deed for the sale of the house. because it says, for $1, LeGrand Curtis, being unable to pay his debts, gives all that real and personal property to Peter Pultz, except what he's allowed to keep by law, which is his furniture, his tools, and his horse. Everything else went to Peter Pultz. I guess your horse was important in 1836. So it's for $1. And Herman said, well, you know, there weren't a lot of banks around, and people gave mortgages to people, and if you didn't pay, you know, you could have taken it back. But Mr. Kendall said, unfortunately, that's all he has. When a house is built, there weren't like permits filed and building plans and site plan review. People just built the house. And when the house was sold, they got the deeds in Poughkeepsie. So this house was built way before 36, but you don't know. You have to try to find out. So I decided to go to, I think the next one is my landlord. Right. So I went to my landlord, the Rhinebeck Reformed Church, and spoke to Bud Rogers, the historian. I said, Bud, pull the file for lot 33. Let's go back and see the first deed that we can find. So he said, there's some missing deeds there. It's not all complete, especially when you go all the way back. So the deed that we found was this one. On the 25th of May in 1812, the elders and deacons of the Low Dutch Reformed Church and John Pauling. I said, who is John Pauling? Now, obviously Pauling's a very famous name there, but there's no reference to him after that. He's not on the lease. I don't know what he had to do with Stephen McCarty or LeGrand Curtis, but that's the only one we could find. And we couldn't find, it's for $11. I did find a deed in like, the next deed was like 1850, when Peter Pultz and the people next door in lot 34 sold the back of those lots, or gave away the back of those lots to the house that's built next to me on Mulberry Street. And that's when the rent dropped from $11 to $9. Some of the land went away. So Herman Teacher said there's one more shot here. Just like Poughkeepsie has the deed index and the deeds, they have mortgage indexes and the mortgages. And maybe you could find a mortgage from Peter Pultz to one of these guys, Stephen McCarty or LeGrand Curtis, 1822 or something, and that's when the house was built. So I went back and looked. It's all in microfilm. It was blinding. But I found 2 mortgages for LeGrand Curtis, one in 1821, one in 1827, for the tavern across the street. So these guys were very involved with each other. Maybe, you know, something happened with the tavern, he lost his house to Peter because he couldn't pay his debts on the tavern. I don't know what happened. So that's about as far as I got. It could be built sometime between 1812 and 1836, probably around 1820. But that's about the best I could do, and I'll give you some examples of some more things that I started on in a minute. So, what about the people that lived in the house? How do you find out about the people? And 200 years ago, it's difficult to find out about what they did and who they were, but you could find out about births, deaths, you could find out about numbers. And we have a lot of that right in this room. Over in those 2 black cabinets on the left is the Nancy and Arthur Kelly genealogy files, which they donated to the library. And I pulled the P file, the Pultz, there's a Pultz file in there, there's a Stickle file in there. And you find a lot of dates, births, deaths, and stuff. Over here, in this cabinet, is all the church records. And it's got births, deaths, marriages, baptisms, genealogy charts for the families of Rhinebeck. So you can get a lot of dates. But getting facts way back then is hard to do. In an age when we know that nothing will ever be lost again, a lot was lost and not recorded 200 years ago. I guess people didn't think it was that important. So let's go back in time, at least over 100 years, to this map, which I found on the web. And here is Mulberry and Market Street. Here is my house with a porch. Look at that. A porch on the house. And the house, little house next door, this giant building here is the Bowery House Tavern. Here's the church. And down here, a couple more houses, and Stephen McCarty, and turns out J.C. McCarty's house as well. So this was what it looked like, before the turn of the 1900s. Exactly the same as it does today, except There's this beautiful peaks here, 2 staircases, the details down here. It's just gorgeous. And it came off at some point in time, I don't know when, but we're guessing this photo was around the 1930s. It's about the best we could guess for it. So it's gorgeous, and you can see what it looks like today to remind you. The one without the porch looks exactly the same, but there's no porch. So Nancy and I tried a lot of things. We looked in voter registration records, and addresses were not written down. Yes, Peter Post, LeGrand Curtis, and Stephen McCarty all voted in Rhinebeck in the 1820s. That didn't help me. We looked in the genealogy, the census records at Ancestry.com, and we came up with this. It's the census record. Next.
What record?
It's the 1820 census. Now, Nancy said, you have to picture, there's a guy walking down Market Street, knocking on doors. And so sometimes, if you know a couple of the people that lived in the houses, you can know who lived in the houses next to them, and you can try to figure it out. But if nobody was home, he comes back the next day, and now it gets out of sequence. So we have, here's LeGrand Curtis. He lived there. Stephen McCarty and Peter Post. But did they live next to each other? Did LeGrand Curtis, was he not home? And did they both live in this house? What was their connection? Why were their names both on this deed? And we have charts that explain what the census records mean. It's the number of males by age group, females by age group, slaves, and free colored people. And you can see that in the next slide, which is the 1820 census totals. And it's free white males, free white females, slaves, by male and female, and free colored people. And here's Rhinebeck. This was after the separation of Rhinebeck and Red Hook. And there were 2,179 people living in Rhinebeck in 1820. So it was pretty big at that point in time.
Is that including the slaves and the free blacks?
Yep, that included everybody. It's just that's Rhinebeck. This is the town of Rhinebeck. It's the whole town. It's the whole town. So we kept trying, and I tried one more thing that someone suggested: real estate records. Today, if you were to look at a property and it said it was $400, the taxes were $400, and $5,000. That's the year the house was built. So I asked Barbara Cunningham, the town clerk, to see if she could find anything in the old town records for me. And she looked and said, 200 years ago, there weren't a lot of good records there. You know, and people didn't keep good records because everybody knew where everybody lived. If you wrote a letter, Peter Pultz, Rhinebeck, New York, not a problem. Everyone knows where he lives. And then Barbara said, you know, nothing's changed in 200 years. A few years ago, they had a tragedy where their house burned down. The next day, the mailman began delivering her mail to town hall. So, Barbara Cunningham, Rhinebeck, New York, is enough to get a letter to her. Nothing's changed in 200 years. We're still a small town. So, some good information can be found in 2 books, which are in this bookcase here, but also available on the web. Google Books is scanning every out-of-print, out-of-copyright book and putting it up on the web. And there's another organization called archive.org, which is scanning every book as well and trying to get it up. You go to Google Books and type in Rhinebeck, up comes this book, which is 1908, Howard Morse, Historic Old Rhinebeck, Echoes of 2 Centuries. And this book actually has stuff. It's got who they were, what they did, a lot of what life was like. There's a lot of good information in that book. And rather than putting on gloves and delicately handling that book, you can read this. You can also convert it, translate it to a PDF. And as I was doing research, I kept cutting and pasting paragraphs into a Word file. And then when it was all done, I printed it out and carefully read it to get information from it. So you can take notes from it as well. And the other great book that was written is the Smith book, which I got on archive.org. I think it's also on Google, 1881. And this too has genealogical records and explanations of what happened. And I got a lot of stuff about the people who lived in the house from these 2 books. So let me give you a little background on these people. First, John Pauling. Not much about his connection to my house. I think everybody knows Henry Pauling was given like 4,000 acres in the late 1600s by the king. He had his son, Henry, who had a son, John, who was a major in the Revolutionary War. And he had a son, John Jr., who was also in the Revolutionary War, who would have been 52 years old in 1812. All I can speculate is it was probably him, John Paul, that signed the deed. But he never built the house. It didn't seem to have anything to do with the house. So I was a dead end with John Paul in. But the next guy, Stephen McCarty, I found a lot of information about Stephen McCarty. His dad, Daniel McCarty, was born in Boston, and in 1754, he was a Minuteman, and a hero of the Revolution in Boston. He moved here, and with his son, Stephen, and became the head miller at Schuyler Mills. And he also had a second son, along with Stephen, John, who became a chaplain in the army and was known as the fighting priest of the Mexican War. And the important thing for me is that Stephen was a local builder. And there's a lot of information in both of these books about the things that Stephen built. He built some houses on Market Street, on Parsonage Street. It said he was listed in one of these books as one of the builders in 1808 of the Dutch Reformed Church. And in 1824, he was one of the major builders of the Stone Church. So he was a carpenter and a builder. He must have built my house, my guess. And he married, and this is important to remember, he married a Nancy Canfield in 1807. Okay, remember that for a minute. Rachel Canfield. He was elected when the village was formed in 1834, the first treasurer. His son was J.C. McCarty, who was a big lawyer. I think he ran for Congress. He was involved in state government. He was town supervisor. He was on the board of the Rhinebeck, Connecticut Railroad. He was a very big guy in town. And he lived in the house until 1820. In his house, which is down the block, the next slide, which is 110 Market Street. And this is the house that Daniel, then the son Stephen, and then J.C. McCarty lived in until 1920. That's the McCarty house diagonally across on the corner of Parsonage and Market Street. So,
Across the deli.
across the deli. So, LeGrand Curtis, the guy that went bankrupt, who was he? Well, it said he married Rachel Canfield in 1815. I said, wait a minute. Stephen McCarty married a Nancy Canfield in 1807. How many Canfields could there be on Market Street in Rhinebeck in that time frame? They have to be sisters. So maybe they're brothers-in-law. And that was the connection between Stephen McCarty and LeGrand Curtis. So I looked up information in his books about LeGrand Curtis. He was Curtis and Collins furniture maker and undertakers. So he built furniture, he made coffins. I guess, you made a lot of things. Actually, a person came to the archives a month ago, talked to Mike and myself. She said there was Collins and Company, furniture makers in the 1840s and 50s on Market Street. She was looking for a Collins relatives. I said, well, there was Curtis and Collins, but maybe he became all Collins in 1836 when LeGrand Curtis, went bankrupt. So she was talking with me about the Collins history, and there's Collins and Curtis. In Red Hook, too, there's a history of Collins and Curtis up in Red Hook. We have our Red Hook experts in the back. I found, Nancy Kelly found this interesting piece of paper for me in a book, in one of these pamphlets that we have here, from the Daybook of LeGrand Curtis, which apparently is somewhere in the archives, but they couldn't find it in Red Hook. But the important thing here, the Wurtemberg Church. What is this? September 26, 1831, LeGrand is bidding on renovating the church. A new roof, pews, new floor, laying the floor. Wait a minute, we didn't have specialists in those days. If you could make furniture, you could make coffins, you were a carpenter. You could renovate a church, you could build a house. So maybe Stephen McCarty and LeGrand Curtis, as a joint venture, built my house, which is my speculation, or my guess. It's hard to know 200 years ago. The last character of that time is Peter Pulse. He was a famous guy. He married Elizabeth Miller. It's nice to know 200 years ago a Miller was living in my house. They had 5 children. Two girls moved away. A son, Manson, who died very early in 1868, age 47, and the 2 spinsters, Eliza and Louisa, who lived in the house until 1890 when it was sold for them. And I tracked down what I believe to be his living conditions on this area on Market Street. The house next to me in 97 was built in 1895. 1795, sorry. It was built in 1795. And Peter lived in that because I went back to Bud Rogers and we found this interesting document on the next slide. Another deed. 21st day of April, 1810, Deacons of the Rhinebeck Reformed Church, Peter Pultz, Lot 34. So he leased that land that that house was built on. So Peter must have moved into that house in 1810 and across the street, across the property to my house in 1836 when he moved to the bigger house with his 5 children. So I also found, which I didn't make a slide of, the same day he signed a lease for Lot 31, the Bowery House Tavern. So he established himself in 1810 by buying that house and buying the tavern. And the descriptions, again, it's 1 chain and 26 links to a stake north of chains and links. So I said, what does that mean? And I looked it up, and a chain is 66 feet, and a link is around 8 inches, which is an English measurement of how you measured from the state turnpike, which was 308 at the time. So he paid $10.50 for Lot 34, but that must have been reduced when they cut the back of Lot 33 and 34 off to build a house next to me.
It's too bad they just didn't make a couple links further away from the sidewalk.
Yes, the house is quite close to the sidewalk. We have the next slide is the tavern. And once again, thanks to Nancy Kelly and the DAR archives, I found this picture, and that's what the tavern looked like at some point. I don't know what year this picture was taken, but it's at least what the tavern looked like. It looks like it's in somewhat disrepair, so it must be a more recent photo. But at least I have a picture of the tavern. And then I cut and pasted a couple of interesting snippets from the Morse book, which is the next slide. It says the tavern was erected in 1800 by Brinkerhoff for a stagehouse, because the Yellowbird stagecoach line ran along that road. And there's a plaque up there today in front of the house that replaced the tavern. The South Street was the main east-west road from the river, from the ferry at the river and out east. It wasn't until 1802 that they punched Market Street through all the way to the Mobile Station corner. It wasn't there at that time, to that corner, and then out Salisbury Turnpike all the way to Connecticut. So that's when the tavern sort of opened up that road. And it also said that, it was released from, there was a problem because this was a tavern. And there was liquor sellers, peddlers, etc. going on in this tavern. It was on church land. So they had to get a release that it was okay to have this tavern. And they said it was a major institution. It rivaled the old hotel, which of course was the Beekman Arms. And no pains were spared to attract custom. I'm not sure what that means. Customers. Next slide. Another interesting facts here. This was a very important place at Rhinebeck. The Post Tavern was put in its earliest days. The walls were a constantly moving panorama. Before its doors distinguished picturesque and unwanted guests passed and repassed. For those whose duty or pleasure was bent on a gathering place, it was the center of life. A local judge and jury settled disputes of the neighborhood. And the eminent stranger to the humblest welfare, the lowest citizen were entertained alike. The assembly room for years was the exhibition place of traveling shows and the ballroom of the town. It was popular at Wayne until his retirement because of old age, and it was given the name of the Bowery House, and it's still standing in 1908, but not today. Wish it was. It would be fun if we still had that building. Peter Pultz. So he was a tavern owner. I'm trying to find out more about him. What else was Peter Pultz? Well, obviously he was very involved in a town. Because the last snippet that I've got, which is really funny, the next slide, is the village was incorporated in May of 1834, and they elected trustees and for the board and a chairman of the board. They didn't have a mayor. So Peter Pultz was elected, and Stephen McCarty elected treasurer. And the next month, the first committee by the first village of Rhinebeck was created The president appointed John Drury, John Jennings, and Peter Pultz a committee to ascertain and report the extent of the sidewalks necessary to be flagged. So the first committee 175 years ago of the village of Rhinebeck was to figure out what to do with the sidewalks.
You're still at it.
And 175 years later, we have a sidewalk committee that is working on trying to improve the sidewalks. And it's been a challenge for a long time. So I'll finish up on Peter Pultz. I did find that there is some good stuff. In the DAR cabinet behind you, is Helen de Laporte had like journals. She wrote stuff down about board meetings, about what life was like, about some of the articles, some of the material from my article last week about slavery in Rhinebeck was gotten from the archives back there for the DAR. So a couple of funny things in there. It said, at the village trustee meeting on June 22nd, 1840, they passed 2 resolutions. First, they banned the firing of guns on East and West Market Street. I like that a lot. I still don't have a problem with that. And the second thing, they instituted a $5 fine for speeding on Market Street.
Wow.
I said, wait a minute, there were no cars. So my wife said, horses, horse carriages. And I guess today we still catch people doing more than 30 miles an hour down Market Street. But inflation is more than $5 now, so it seems to work. Peter was elected town tax collector. He was on the highway committee for the town in 1840. And there's a note in Helen de Laporte's thing that says, 1840, the next meeting of the highway department will be at Pultz's house. So I know that in 1840, there was a meeting of the highway department in my living room, which is nice to know. And then it sort of ended pretty quickly. Peter transferred the house to his daughters for $1 in 1861. He sold the tavern in 1868 to J.C. McCarty, the lawyer. Interesting. And his son Manson died that same year, a year after his wife died. So I guess Peter was sort of folding up shop, because 4 years later, in 1872, he died. So I'm going to jump over Jacob, Hannahberg, and Franklin Reichert for the sake of time. Talk about the next family. I lived in the house for 40 years, and that was the Stickles. And thanks to Jan Stickle, I have this great photograph of the 3 Stickle boys. Frank Stickle, Alfred L., and A. Lee. And the stuff I found out about births and deaths, he was born in 1826, so I'm guessing he looks about a year old. This was probably around 1927, excuse me. So those are the 3 guys. Frank bought it in 1909, and then his son and his son were all involved in the house.
Rhinebeck Savings
And
Bank.
his dad.
He was the president of Rhinebeck Savings Bank.
Yeah.
Yes, I've got a lot of...
Was it treasurer?
Okay, so how do you find that information? We have more information 100 years later about people. We have our archives on the web. So if you look at rhinebeckhistory.org, or you can look at the Consortium of Rhinebeck History, there's information for Red Hook, for some of the churches, for all the members of the consortium. And the next example is just the Rhinebeck History. This is rhinebeckhistory.org, and this is the Consortium of Rhinebeck History. You can look by dates, title, description, topic, author. I just typed in Stickle as an example to see what came up. So I typed in Stickle, up came some stuff about the Stickles, and this one said, in 1995, 041.1, which is a box in there, 1995-041, the year it was donated to us. In folder 1, there's something about the 1908 YMCA in Rhinebeck. List about it, and it mentions a Stickle. So okay, so I went into the room and I got that folder out, pulled out the pamphlet on the YMCA, and up came, I took a picture of it. Here is the YMCA, it's the Star Building. Behind it was the Upstate Theater, which was the gymnasium, the swimming pool. It was a nice facility that we had. You know, I wish we still had it today. And it lists a lot of famous Rhinebeck people, and your families Kuhn, Tremper, and Tracy Dowse, and Frank B. Stickle was a director. And of course, this is before the Titanic, so there's John Jacob Asser as a trustee. So that's how you can look up information about people or topics or anything, looking it up on the web, and you can come here when we're here on Thursdays, and we can pull the information for you, and you can see what it is. So Frank married Rosie Stickle. You can see he was in that picture, sitting in the car in 1915 in front of my house. And I know that he passed away in 1941, and the date, so I looked it up. We have 150 years of the Gazette advertisers in that room. We also have it on microfilm in the cabinet that Mike is using with his laptop, and a microfilm reader. If you know the dates, you could look something up. And most people come here, I want the obituary of my grandfather, and I know the day he died, and you look up a couple of gazettes before or after that date, and you hopefully will find something. I tried. Mike said, you have to be lucky. I looked up, I knew Peter Peltz's death, I knew LeGrand Curtis's death, and it said, Peter Peltz died last week. LeGrand Curtis died last week. Well, I was much luckier with this. I got a whole front page, because Frank Stickle was an important guy, a front page Gazette ad for this. And I just took a piece of it, buried today, Frank B. Stickle, whose services were held this Thursday afternoon at his home on East Market Street. So my living room again was used, and now was used for the funeral services for Frank Stickle. And when you print it out, you can see it says that Frank Stickle was born in the town of Clinton. He spent his youth in there, and then he became a florist. It said he liked to, he was interested in amateur trotting races, which were run on Montgomery Street. We have trotting races on Montgomery Street. He was a member of the Dutch Reformed Church, and he served.
Put in speeding limitations.
Probably. And he served as a director of the First National Bank of Rhinebeck from 1918 until the time of his death. And he leaves his son, Ailey Stickle, and of course the grandchild Alfred L. So the thing that is a project that we have now is I want to tell you about it, because this is a black hole. Unless you know dates, you can't find anything in this 150 years of Gazette advertisers. We are working with some guys who hopefully now have the technology to scan that microfilm and not only bring it up on the web, but index it. So you could type in Frank B. Stickle. I'm sure an important guy like this, there must have been 20, 30 articles about him. But other than his obituary, unless you wanted to sit there and read 30 years of Gazette advertisers to try to find something about Frank, you're not going to. So if we get this project done, and we'll open up the Gazette advertiser, it's wonderful. Because you can see the next slide, I subscribed to the New York Times, and I typed in Frank B. Stickle, and up comes this from the Times, June 26, 1941. He died at Northern Dutchess Health Center. He's a retired banker and florist and stuff. So if we succeed with this project, we'll be just as good as the Times. You will go on the web, type in violets in Rhinebeck or the Rhinebeck Connecticut Railroad, and all the articles in all the gazettes would come up. And then you can actually look at them on the web, which will be great. So Mike and I are working on this project. It would be great if we get this thing done. Very, very exciting. And then there's one more that I found in the Gazette, Alfred L. Stickle from 4/15/99, and it said he owns Stickle's Variety Store in Rhinebeck, and it's still open today. We love that store. I'm leaving if anything ever happens to that store, because everybody that comes to see me says, I want to go see the store. And I have taken them to see the store. And he was also a director of the First National Bank of Rhinebeck until 1993. So the last family I'm going to talk about is the Kliegers, Dr. Klieger. And a lot of people now knew him, and everybody says, oh, he threw great parties, I danced in your living room, I had my teeth cleaned in your house, he was great. A person who I won't name said, oh, I was good friends with the Klieger daughter, and we used to throw water balloons out the window onto Market Street of people, and at a party I got sick and I threw up in your bedroom. Okay? So there's a lot of history, and Joy Gross got me in touch with Andrew Klieger, Cy's son, on Facebook, and he lives in Virginia near his dad, who's in a nursing home, still alive. And I've been sending the articles and the pictures I've been finding to Andrew, who's been sharing them with his dad. And I hope I'm going to share this video with them when I send it to Andrew as well, so his dad can see the video. So a friend came to dinner last year, on the next slide, my friend Stan, and he gave me this. Here's a souvenir. I said, I had my teeth cleaned by Dr. Klieger too. I said, I don't know what year this was, in the 70s. He said, but here, I had to part April 10th to get my teeth cleaned in your house. So Andrew told me a lot of adventures, and I've had a lot of adventures in the house myself. 200 years old, it's like you're battling a sinking ship to stop it from leaking. It springs leaks all the time and surprises you. But I love it, and it's wonderful. And it's a great shape for something that's 200 years old. I'll just end with one story of mine. 2 years after I moved in, the septic system stopped working. I said, what is this? I don't know about septic systems. In the city, you flush the toilet, goes into the Hudson River, no questions asked.
Now you're drinking it.
So this guy comes over, Royal Flush, I love the name, and he said, I got to find the opening. He's all over the yard. So I called the previous owner, which was Dr. Hal Book and his wife Lisa Baer, who owned the Haven Spa. I said, where is the septic system? Oh, I remember from a long time ago, it's off the sun porch, somewhere out there. So my handyman and I, we dig this way, we dig that way, can't find anything. So I call him back, I gotta find this thing. I said, you know who knows? The former mayor, Peter Sipley, and you can find him, he did it, you can find him at the highway department. I call him, leave a message, the secretary calls me back, my brother Vern did it. You can find him at the firehouse on Friday night. So I said, this is crazy, I gotta fix this thing. I come home from work, there's a hole dug and a pipe going under the sun porch. I said, elves, leprechauns, how did this happen? Well, up the walkway comes my leprechaun, Vern Sipley. I said, you must be Vern Sipley. He said, you must be the crazy guy that dug up his whole yard. Why didn't you call me? I didn't know who you were until yesterday. I said, why'd you put the septic under the sun porch? I didn't, he said. I put it on top. He put the sun porch on top of my septic system. I didn't do that. And then he told me for the next hour where all the pipes go. So my last source of information about your house is the wonderful people that live in Rhinebeck. And as long as we have great people like Jan Stickel or Bill Gay or Herman Tejan or Vernon Peter Sipley or Nancy Kelly, you can talk to your neighbors, you can ask questions, and people from the audience have been saying, where's the porch? People know stuff, and that's a good source of getting information about your house. So I hope it's been informative. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer. I have handouts, I have the web addresses, and I have